Welcome to this tonight's event and interview with Andrew Maraniss and Dr. Sean Kent. We are grateful to see such a wonderful turnout. It's great to see a lot of fans of this book show up and hear the author speak and hear this interview. I'd just like to say a personal thank you to Andrew for being here today. It was such a wonderful experience for us all. We're lucky to have Andrew back. You know him perhaps as author of Strong Inside, the Perry Wallace story. Perry was a Vanderbilt graduate. He was the first African American to play basketball in the SEC. And Strong Inside became a national nonfiction bestseller. This new book, Games of Deception, is about the first ever U.S. Olympic basketball team that competed in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Germany. During that Olympics, basketball itself appeared for the very first time as an Olympic sport. And of course, the book traces the unfortunate realities of anti-Semitism and racism, not only in Germany, but in our own country during that period. So without further ado, I just want to turn things over to Dr. Sean Kent from MBA, as he's going to conduct an interview with Andrew. So
yes,
thank you for being here.
Is the mic on? Can everyone hear us? Great. Thank you guys for coming. This has been, as Emmett said, our relationship with Andrew Maraniss now goes several years. And he's come here. He's been a friend of the school before, and we're really excited to have him here. Unfortunately, this evening, we don't have two of the people that Andrew knew from his years in college. So I wanted to start off by Andrew talking about two people he knows well, Kevin England and Ronnie McMahon. You guys all know him, those two guys, as basketball coaches. Andrew knew them as basketball players. What can you tell this crowd about Kevin and Ron?
All right. Well, first of all, again, thank you for having me here. This has been a terrific day, and I'm really looking forward to visiting some more classes tomorrow. I love it. I've got a son who's in kindergarten, and so I've just been sort of walking around admiring this place and picturing little Charlie here possibly someday. But I'll start with Ronnie. Ronnie McMahon was a great three-point shooter in college, and he had this habit of kicking his legs out when he shot his threes trying to get a foul so he could get a four-point play. You know, and I think when he graduated, he was the second all-time leading scorer in Vanderbilt history. So you guys, he was a legit player. He was a great player. Vanderbilt had a team in 1993 that went to the Sweet 16, and Ronnie and Kevin were both big parts of that team. Kevin was sort of a local boy, done well, you know, Nashville kid, Franklin kid, who had a great career at Vanderbilt. And I remember I worked in the sports information office at Vanderbilt when he was a senior, and it was senior night, you know, and there's sort of a emotional ceremony before the game, and it was my job every year to write the script for the public address announcer, a little bit of information about each player. And I remember how important it felt writing Kevin that night, because he was so beloved and such an accomplished player, and that's what I'll always remember about his days at Vandy.
Yeah, I love the idea of Ronnie shooting. I think he held the Vanderbilt career three-point record until
Shane Foster came on.
Right. Let's go to you briefly. Andrew and I were just talking among our shared interests. We have a shared background. He went to a high school in Austin, Texas, as I did, then to Vanderbilt. Could you, for those of you in the audience who don't know your biography, after graduating from Vanderbilt, you worked for Vanderbilt for a while, sports information office?
Yes. So, as you mentioned, I went to high school in Texas, but I didn't grow up there. I was born in Madison, Wisconsin, so I'm a Packers fan. I was excited yesterday. Pretty much grew up in Washington, D.C., but we moved to Austin when I was in high school. I came to Vanderbilt, to Nashville, on the Fred Russell Grantland Rice sports writing scholarship to Vandy, which is what brought me here. When I graduated, my first job was at Vandy in the athletic department. I was the publicist for the men's basketball team there. Baseball has always been my favorite sport, so when I was in college, I was applying to work for every Major League Baseball team, and I was rejected by every Major League Baseball team. Finally, in '98, the Diamondbacks and the Devil Rays, as they were known at the time, came along, and so I got a job as the media relations manager for the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, their first season of '98. In some ways, it was my dream job. as a big baseball guy. In other ways, sort of soured me on my favorite sport because the job really wasn't what I expected it to be. My going away present was great. I got to take batting practice at Yankee Stadium at the end of that year. Came back to Nashville, worked at a public relations firm here where I met AJ's mom and helped introduce her to her husband, and was there for 18 years, and the last 8 of those years working on the book Strong Inside. And since then, decided that writing books is what I really love to do, and so I've carved out a position at Vanderbilt Athletics as a visiting author there, which allows me to write more books for you guys. My niche that I'd like to continue to develop is writing sports-related nonfiction with a history and sort of social justice angle for middle school and high school kids.
Great. Let's talk then about the Perry Wallace Project. I know it was in your brain for a long time, and then you researched the book for a number of years. How long did that gestate before it?
So the first time I ever wrote about Perry was when I was 19 years old for a Black History class at Vanderbilt. And I had learned about him, because I didn't grow up here, I didn't know anything about Perry or Vandy, in a newspaper article written by a kid who was a year older than me, whose name is Dave Sheinin. He's a highly regarded sports writer for the Washington Post now. And they talked about the first game that Perry ever played as a freshman at Mississippi State in 1967, and how he thought that he might get shot and killed just for stepping onto the basketball court. So that was the first time I wrote about him. And that paper always stayed on my mind for years after I got out of college. And finally, 17 years later, I came back to it, to the same topic, and decided that what if Jackie Robinson's story was not known? What if no one had ever written a book about him? That's the way I felt about Perry Wallace, that he just deserved to have his story told. And so I'd never written a book before, but I knew a little bit about him. So I said, well, why not me? And it took me 8 years. I had no idea what I was getting into. So I spent 4 years just on the research and interviews, and then another 4 years writing the book. At that stage, I didn't have an agent or a publisher, and so I was just going to self-publish it if necessary, but ultimately Vanderbilt University Press published that book. Then, to tie back to MBA, I met Ruta Sepetys, who's, I know, a great friend of the school, and so many kids get to go to Lithuania these days. And I was at Fido Coffee Shop in Hillsborough Village and met Ruta, and she was there doing an interview with the Tennessean about Salts of the Sea, one of her books. And Ruta, being the nicest person in the world, stopped her interview, publicizing her book, to ask me questions about my book. And by the end of that conversation, she said, I think kids need to know Perry Wallace's story. Also, let me send your book into her publisher. So it was thanks to her sort of endorsement of that book that Penguin editors read the book. And so I had a young reader's edition of Strong Inside come out, and then they're the same publisher for this book here.
Sure, stick with it. You mentioned in assembly today that Perry Wallace, in addition to his historical significance, is probably for you maybe the most admirable person you've ever met, impactful. You know, he came here when those years ago when that was our summer reading book, and you could kind of sense just being in his presence, his gravitas, but also his warmth, his generosity, his intelligence. Could you talk more about him and how just his personality impacted you?
Well, that's well put. I mean, that was seeing him for what, 20 minutes, right? And you got all that. That's the way Perry was when you were in his presence. And I think this is a cool thing. You notice it around Nashville because there's a decent number of celebrities in this town. But you meet certain people and they're the one that you think you're looking up to, and they're the special one, but they make you feel special, and that's the way Perry Wallace was. He was a kid that was a valedictorian at his high school, was an engineering major at Vanderbilt. He graduated from Columbia University Law School. He sang opera, he played the trumpet, he spoke, I think, 3 languages by the time he got to college. At home, he and his wife would watch the news on a French channel. They both spoke fluent French. He was a real Renaissance man, He was an MBA type of guy. But of course, when he came along, he wouldn't have been allowed to come to school here. And so that's what was sort of tragic about his life, what he had to overcome being this prince of a man. And I'm not just talking about his days as a high school kid in Nashville or Vanderbilt, but even throughout the whole rest of his career. He was putting up with racism that was, could have defeated almost anyone, but Perry was able to continue on, and I just admired his strength and his courage so much.
Yeah. I mean, in the almost epilogue to Strong Inside, he had a special needs son and became a leader in that way as well. And, broadening awareness of special needs students. I mean, the story of Perry Wallace really kept going on.
It keeps going, and in February, for those of you who are interested in Perry, they'll be renaming 25th Avenue, where it runs in front of Memorial Gym, from West End to Blakemore, Perry Wallace Way. And so his widow, Karen, and his daughter, Gabby, will be coming to Nashville for that. And I'm really proud, that his name will be out there for future generations to see every day.
Perry Wallace's relationship to Vanderbilt was strained. After his graduation, he, in his sort of exit interview with local newspapers, he expressed his bitterness about some of his treatment. So for years, there was a kind of divide between the university and him. But you helped heal that, didn't you? I mean, in the last years of his life, he came back for a number of conferences and seminars, and he was honored on campus. You have to feel good about that.
Yes, but I don't want to take any credit for that. It was all about Perry himself and a new administration there they were both willing to come back together. And what Perry would say, he had so many brilliant ways of looking at things. What he said is, reconciliation without the truth is just acting. And a lot of times, institutions, schools, organizations want to have these reconciliation moments, at least for a photo op, to say, well, everything's good now. But he said far too often it's just for show. And so, but he said if the truth is present, then that reconciliation can be real. And so that is the one way that I'll say the book was a part of that, because the truth of Perry's story was able to be known by so many people if they read the book, or if they heard Perry when he was invited back to campus or to schools like this. And so he felt like this reconciliation that happened over the last 5 years or so of his life was real, and I was definitely proud of that.
Is my memory correct that Godfrey Dillard also came back and was part of one of these, at least?
Yes, so Godfrey Dillard was Perry's one African-American teammate his freshman year at Vandy. So back then, you guys think about freshmen in college basketball, they're one and done, right? They're off to the NBA. Back then, they couldn't even play varsity in college if you were a freshman. So they had a freshman team and a varsity team. And Godfrey Dillard was very different personality than Perry Wallace. Godfrey came down from Detroit. The only reason he wanted to be in Nashville was to participate in the civil rights movement. He was very vocal and outspoken, and he was more than a lot of people in Nashville ready to handle, I guess, in the late 60s. And so he was experiencing the same racism that Perry Wallace was, and was not afraid to tell everybody about what he saw. And he was right, but people had a bad reaction to what he was saying, and he was demoted from the basketball team and transferred to a school in Eastern Michigan. And at the time he left, he said, I hate white people, I hate Vanderbilt, I'm never going to step foot on this campus again. And last year he was on campus proposing a toast to the chancellor into the university. So it's been really interesting to see this transformation and this healing that's taken place with him also. And that was thanks to Perry, I would say. I mean, Godfrey's in the book, but every time Perry was invited back to the campus, he would make sure that Godfrey was invited back too. Would give Godfrey a chance to talk and for people to really finally get to know him and what he was all about. And I think Perry was as proud of that reconciliation with Godfrey as he was about anything else.
Yeah, really worthy of his own book. He's an interesting character.
He's a great guy. He went to law school as well. He's a diplomat. He speaks French too. He was a State Department employee in West Africa. Amazing person.
Well, let's transition to the new book, Games of Deception. NBA community, we've read 2 books that also involve the 1936 Olympic Games. We read Boys in the Boat about the 8-man crew team, and we also read Unbroken about Louis Zamperini, who competed as well. In those books, the athletic contests, especially Boys in the Boat, man, the boat race was extraordinary, really was. In your book, it's a common, please tell the crowd a little bit about just maybe the gold medal game for the Olympic basketball team.
So the basketball competition, this is the first time basketball has ever been played in the Olympics, and it wasn't a very popular sport in Germany at all. And so they made them play the entire basketball tournament outside on clay tennis courts. And it worked out fine for the first round or 2 of the Olympics, but then when the time came for the day of the gold medal game, It was a pouring rainstorm for 24 hours leading up until the game, and it was raining during the game. The Americans were saying, can we please move this game inside? The Olympic officials said, well, we play soccer outside in the rain, so you can play basketball outside in the rain. And the court turned into just a big, soupy mud puddle, basically. Players would try to dribble the ball, just get stuck in the mud, wouldn't bounce back up to them. The ball itself got really waterlogged, so it was really heavy, hard to shoot the ball, it was hard to hold on to it. A reporter described holding onto the ball as like trying to hold onto a bar of soap in the bathtub, just squirting out of everybody's hands. And so the game, even by the standards of 1930s, was just a farce of a game. The final score was 19-8, United States beat Canada. And so, it's one reason why this book is called Games of Deception. The deception is really about the deception of Berlin and the propaganda that was used, but also I think sort of deceiving to think about the birth of this Olympic sport that now is the most famous athletes in the world are on the U.S. Olympic basketball team. At that point it was really an afterthought of an event played outside in a muddy basketball court.
I think about when people ask me, do I like Andrew's books, I always say he writes about basketball. I'm a basketball fan. And one of the topics I always think about that's interesting, 1936, the basketball game was very different. And yet, at least one of the players on the 1936 team, I think would have been a player today. You talk a lot about it. Am I getting his name right? Joe Fortenberry.
Joe Fortenberry.
Yeah.
So, a young man was asking me about Joe Fortenberry before we got started here today. You were asking, right? Yeah, so he was a big, strong, tall guy from West Texas. And I interviewed his son, Oliver, for the book. Joe Fortenberry is considered the first player ever to dunk the basketball in a game. And I think it's probably impossible to literally prove that. There weren't people recording dunks at every single basketball game in the 1930s. But he was definitely the first player ever to dunk the ball in a game in New York City. And the way that the New York media is, if it's the first time it's happened there, it must be the first time it's happened anywhere, right? So his team played at Madison Square Garden. Fortenberry dunked the ball. There was no term dunked the ball yet. And so this reporter for the New York Times had to figure out how he was to describe this unusual shooting motion to his readers. And I found the article, and he said it looked like a cafeteria customer dunking their roll in coffee. And so that's where this term dunk comes from Joe Fortenberry, a member of this first U.S. Olympic basketball team.
What got me, another concept that basketball had not created yet was goaltending.
Right.
So you had Joe Fortenberry, who evidently could not just 6'8", but could jump, right? And he could protect the rim.
Yeah, he'd stand basically next to the basket and jump up and catch shots as they came. In the Olympics, they were even playing with a rule that had already been, it wasn't a rule anymore in the United States, but it was in the Olympics, and it was to have a center jump after every single basket. So rather than the other team scores, you take the ball out of bounds and start running up the court, they would stop, go back to center court. Americans had by far the tallest team in the tournament, so we would score and then win the jump ball and keep possession. So it was a big advantage for the American team at those
I wonder how Canada scored 8 points. I think the personalities in Games of Deception, the historical background on it, I hope you've all talked about and we've read with Hitler's hosting those games. But the personalities in Games of Deception are what I think make it a page turner. So I want you to talk about a couple of my favorites. Sam Walter is a really interesting guy whose dilemma about playing the games really crystallizes the whole issue.
Yes, so Sam Walter had played college basketball at UCLA. And the way that they formed the Olympic team that year, players didn't try out as individuals the way they would now. They played a tournament, a qualifying tournament, similar to like a March Madness style tournament. And what they said is whichever two teams advanced to the championship game, those entire rosters would be combined, because there were only 7 guys on the team back then, would be combined to become the U.S. Olympic basketball team. And so the two teams that played in that championship at Madison Square Garden, one, they were called the McPherson Refiners. They were from a small town in Kansas. They worked at an oil refinery. And the other team was called the Universals. And that's because they worked at Universal Pictures in Hollywood. They worked on movies. The guy that started the team there, his name was Jack Pierce. He was the head makeup artist at Universal. And he's the one that created, if you picture Frankenstein in your mind, this is the guy that created that look for Frankenstein in the movies. And they had a basketball team as a way to go around to different towns with Universal on their jerseys he would dress the players up before the game in the costumes of their movie characters, and it was a way to promote their movies. And so the team from Universal beat the team from Kansas in the championship game. They both earned the right to become the Olympic team. And as they're walking off the court, a reporter asked Sam Balter, "So are you going to Berlin?" And the reason why that was an important question for Sam Balter is because he was Jewish. And he was the one Jewish member of the U.S. basketball team that was headed to Adolf Hitler's Germany to play in these Olympics. And so he said that moment is when it really hit him, like he had a big decision to make. And so he asked for advice from friends and from rabbis and from Jewish people in Los Angeles. And eventually he decided that too many people had strong opinions for him. And he decided to go, almost just to shut up everybody that told him not to go, which was a really interesting decision that he made, because there was a very strong boycott effort in the United States at that time. The people sometimes now will say, well, how much did we really know about what was happening in Nazi Germany in 1934, 35, leading up to the Olympics? But there were a lot of people that had a good sense of what was happening. There were 100,000 people that marched through the streets of New York City. I have a picture of that in the book, protesting Hitler, the idea of playing in the Olympics over there. We had a basketball team at Long Island University, which was the best college team in the country at the time, and they voted to boycott even the U.S. qualifying tournament. They had 4 or 5 Jewish players on their team, and the coach asked them, if any one of you is uncomfortable, none of us are going. And 7 hands went up. So it wasn't just the Jewish players that. So even college basketball players knew enough to boycott this qualifying tournament. But Balter decided that the best thing he felt he could do was to go, to play well, to win a gold medal, and that would be the way he would stand up to Hitler, which is basically what Jesse Owens decided also.
Balter also, he feared that if he played, he might suffer backlash among the Jewish community back home.
Yes.
It might hurt his job prospects. He didn't know.
Right.
Now, he went on to have a great career, though.
Yes, Sam Balter, so if any of you guys watch ESPN, have you ever seen SportsCenter? Sam Balter was basically the forerunner of that. He had a national sports radio show for years that was the first of its kind. So he was giving highlights and telling human interest stories on the radio before really people watched TV, as the national voice of sports, basically. And this was the same Sam Balter that had been on that team.
Am I right, too? Frank Lubin was on that team, a guy who also, I think, went to UCLA, but then developed as a player afterward. But he went on to be a coach, right, and a great ambassador for the game. Yes, so
Frank Lubin was the one member of the U.S. Olympic team that stayed in Berlin after the Olympics were over. And so, you know, the games of deception, the whole city of Berlin was meant to deceive the world into thinking that everything was just fine in Nazi Germany. You know, the way they sort of beautified the city and these hospitable hosts for all the international visitors. They took down all the anti-Semitic signs during the 2 weeks of the Olympics. Frank Lubin stayed, and so he saw all these signs go back up and this facade come down and the real Berlin emerge. And the reason he stayed is his parents were from Lithuania, and the country of Lithuania really didn't play basketball at that point. And so they invited Frank Lubin to stay in Europe, go to their country, and teach the game there. So if you guys do go to Lithuania, next time you're there, ask him about Frank Lubin. And in Mr. Russell's class, there's a picture of Arvydas Sabonis. He's probably the greatest Lithuanian basketball player ever. People like Sabonis and another player named Šarūnas Marškėliūnas, they all talk about Frank Lubin the way we would talk about James Naismith. You know, he's the father of basketball there, because after the Olympics, he stayed and he taught the game. Of course, Lithuania becomes part of the Soviet Union against their will, and the great Soviet teams had primarily Lithuanian stars on their team. So when the Soviets beat the United States in 1972, it's the first time we ever didn't win the gold medal. It was players that had been coached by the disciples of Frank Lubin.
And then in 1988, I remember that team.
And then the Lithuanians come along with their own independent team. And
I remember 1988,
Sabonis
was still playing in the USSR, but in the height of his physical prime, he outplayed David Robinson, and David Robinson was quite a player. A lot of heroes to talk about. I have to talk about a villain, too. Reading Games of Deception, the personality that makes you want to tear your hair out is Avery Brundage, who was the chair of the U.S. Olympic Committee at that time. He was himself actively pro-Nazi. He was not simply an anti-Semite.
Right.
He had business dealings with the Nazis, and he actively helped the Nazis in their hosting of the games, covering up some of the problems.
Mm-hmm.
It brings to mind a hypothetical question, like what might have happened if the United States had a more enlightened director of the Olympic Committee?
Well, I think we wouldn't have gone, is probably the answer. So there's the Avery Brundage archives at the University of Illinois, and I spent a day there looking through his papers, file folders just sort of overflowing with anti-Semitic newsletters and magazines that he was subscribing to. So when you had 100,000 people marching through the streets of New York City saying we shouldn't go to those Olympics, on the other side you had Avery Brundage and his followers. Brundage was writing letters to Nazis in Germany telling them to send favorable news coverage of the Nazi regime to American newspapers to balance out the negative coverage of Nazi Germany. And so he went on what was supposed to be a fact-finding trip to Berlin ahead of the vote to determine whether we were going to the Olympics or not. And he was really excited to be there because he loved these hosts of his. And everywhere he went, even when he went to interview Jewish athletes to supposedly ask them how they were being treated, he would have a Nazi in full uniform standing right behind him. You know, so what was he going to really hear? He told the Nazis that his private club in Chicago wouldn't admit Jewish members either. So he was trying not to hurt their feelings, you know. And his construction firm was scheduled to build a new German embassy in Washington, D.C. So he had his own sort of selfish financial motivation to make sure that we participated in those Olympics also. So I think if you had a more open-minded sort of American Olympic Committee leader who was trying to really find out the truth, the vote was so close. If you didn't have a strong leader like Brundage arguing that we should go, I don't think there's any question we wouldn't have gone.
I wonder, too, at the games, how many of you have seen the movie about Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics? There's a moment in it when the U.S. Olympic Committee capitulates to the Nazis and don't allow their Jewish runners to participate. I think, could a U.S. Olympic Committee member have stood up to the Nazis at that point and said, no, these are our athletes?
Absolutely. So there was runners Sam Stoller and Marty Glickman who were scheduled to be part of the U.S. Relay team, I think in the either 4x400 or 4x100 relay. And we had by far the best relay team. These guys had been on the team in the qualifying tournament in New York City. They were supposed to be out there. And I don't know if this has been 100% proven that that's why they were pulled, but everyone seems to believe that there's no doubt this is why they were pulled at the very last minute. Of course, one of the people that replaced, at least one of them, was Jesse Owens. So the coach could easily say, well, we've got the best athlete in the world that we're replacing these guys with. But even Jesse Owens said, hey, I've already won 3 gold medals. I don't need another one. These guys are on this team. They deserve to be there. And the story goes that they were pulled at the last minute so that we would not further embarrass Hitler by 2 Jewish athletes winning a gold medal. There are also 2 African women who were supposed to be on the U.S. Women's relay team. And right before their meet, they were pulled from the track also. For one of those women, it was the second time that happened. She was supposed to be the first black woman to run for the U.S. track team in the 32 Olympics in Los Angeles, and they pulled her from the track at the last minute as well.
All right, I do want to transition and talk a little bit about writing. When I interviewed Andrew when the young adult version of Strong Inside came out, I asked him about what were sort of the joys of writing for a YA audience. I know that with both that book and with this one, you've toured around and met with lots of schools. Could you describe a little bit, what's the difference in writing for adults versus writing for a young adult readership?
My favorite part about it is being with you guys, you know. And I think it's cool to be at a boys' school today and tomorrow because I'm trying to write for everyone, boys and girls, kids and adults. But there is a real issue of young men not reading as much as girls, you know, and I hope that girls are just as interested in my books as you guys are. But it's just a fact. I think the young men are not reading as much as girls. And so what I'm trying to do is write the types of books that I would have loved to have read when I was a kid. And I think that sports, whether you like it or not, it's part of our lives every day, right? And so it can be an accessible way to get into a subject. And so my book about Perry Wallace was really about racism and civil rights and what it takes out of a person to be a pioneer, as much as it was about basketball, but I felt basketball would be a good hook to get you into it. Same thing with this book, you know, and so it gives me a lot of happiness. There's a dad in the back who said that his son was really excited about reading this book, Jack, right? And really enjoyed it. And that makes me really happy when I meet a young man who's like latched on to the book. And so to me, that's even the biggest difference than when I would go out and speak to adults about my books. I didn't take as much personal satisfaction from looking at an adult on my book, but getting a young person interested in it just really means a lot to me. And I understand what's the very best part about being a teacher is that feeling of having some sort of impact on a young person's life. And I get to be the lucky one that just gets to swoop in for a day or two, you know, and tell a story of a book that I've been working on. But it's just personally meaningful to me.
I'll say, too, in both these books, the biggest difference between Strong Inside the adult version is not language. And in Games of Deception, I got to tell you, it's not content. It's a disturbing book. There's some really terrible stuff that happens in it. I think it's just length. You know, you don't go 400 pages.
Right. That's the way I try to approach it, is just length. Hopefully when you see that book, it doesn't seem like intimidating. It seems like a book that you could probably manage, right? And so I also hope that that would appeal to adults, too, who have less and less time, you know? And a big doorstop of a book, even for an adult, sometimes can seem like a challenge. So the length is probably the biggest difference. Also just the subjects that I'm choosing to write about, I think hopefully they can be educational and fun to kids. And then the venues that I go, obviously, are more skewed towards young people. But I had a day a month ago where in the morning I spoke to a 5th grade class. In the afternoon I spoke at high school. And in the evening I spoke at a retirement home, telling the exact same story. You know, and so it was really interesting to do that, and everybody seemed to get something out of it.
And I like, too, I think Games of Deception and Strong Inside, when young readers walk away from this book, they might go in any number of directions. They might take Perry Wallace's story and then go to the civil rights movement. They might read Games of Deception and become history buffs, but they also might be curious about the evolution of basketball, what happens in the next 30 years. We're about out of time. I have one last question. I think it's on everyone's mind. LSU or Clemson today?
Well, my host today is a diehard Clemson fan, so I think I'd be in big trouble when I see another Clemson sweatshirt over here. I see one LSU sweatshirt back over there. Is that another LSU? Yeah, another LSU there. I mean,
You're on the spot.
Yeah. Emmett's been so nice to me. I'll go with Clemson tonight.
Andrew Manners, thank you.
Before you go,
I wanted to thank a couple of people who made the tonight happen. First, Dr. Kinch, interviewing Mr. Maraniss, did a great job. Also, Mr. Russell's the catalyst for bringing Mr. Maraniss here. He's done all the heavy lifting, but I really appreciate it. Our visiting writer program has been fantastic for the last decade for a lot of reasons. I appreciate Mr. Russell. Let's give him a hand. We have some books. Maraniss books out there with some of Games of Deception, and maybe, I'm not sure some of that. And Mr. Maraniss will be out there, I think, signing some books for a while. So thank you very much. We appreciate you guys coming.